Chapter 13. Clara. The view as they stepped out onto the field took Clara's breath away. The field itself couldn't be much larger than college fields, but the stands were packed, which made it feel so much bigger. "Pretty impressive, isn't it?" Justin said from behind her. Clara forced a smile and took a small step to her left. She liked Justin as a boss, but he'd been acting as if he were going to ask her out since she'd started, and she wanted none of that. Not only was he probably 10 years her senior, but he reeked of a recent divorce. She had no desire to be anybody's rebound girl, even if her heart hadn't still been attached to Mason. "Yeah, it is." His eyes raked over her for a moment, and then he jerked his head to the right. "We set up over here." She followed him to a shaded area where a single table and several chairs were set up near a pop-up medical tent. They were a fairly new addition to the pro football arena to allow players privacy if they were injured on the field. Clara wasn't sure how she felt about them. On one hand, she agreed that players deserved their privacy. But on the other hand, she also knew that sometimes players were pressured to get a shot and keep playing when their injury might be much more serious. Several feet from the table and chairs, players were stretching and tossing balls back and forth to each other. Her eyes found Mason, and she couldn't help but admire how good he looked in the tight pants. Though she'd seen him in uniform in high school, and he had looked good then, he had definitely filled out and put on some muscle since then. He'd always had broad shoulders, but the pads made his waist look even trimmer. She could see his muscles flex as he ran to catch a ball, and she held her breath, hoping that there would be no grimace of pain. Relief flooded her when he appeared to be okay. Before she knew it, the game was beginning. Having always been a football fan, she found herself even more enthralled getting to see the game this close. She could hear the hum of conversations on the sidelines, though she couldn't hear the exact words, and the sound from the stands was so loud that it was almost deafening. She found herself cheering along whenever the Tornadoes gained yardage, and sighing whenever they dropped balls or lost yards. The game was going to be a close one. Both teams were evenly matched, and Clara found herself holding her breath every time Mason was thrown the ball. With just 2 minutes until halftime, she finally felt her body relax. There was only time for a few more plays, and then he would be safe, at least during halftime. And maybe she'd been wrong. He seemed to be okay. She couldn't see any noticeable limping. Blaine stepped back, and she watched as he scanned the field for an open receiver. His right arm cocked back, and the ball went up in the air. She watched as it spun in a perfect spiral and sailed over the heads of the players in the middle of the field toward Mason, who was close to the end zone. It was slightly over his head, and he had to jump to reach it. His hands closed around the ball, and he tucked in like normal, but as he was coming down, a player from the opposing team ran into him. Clara held her breath as he hit the ground. She couldn't tell if he had landed on his foot, but either way it had looked to be a hard hit. The opposing player got up, but Mason stayed on the ground. "No!" The word came out louder than she expected, and Davis turned to look at her. She clapped her hand over her mouth to keep from shouting anything more and kept her eyes on the scene. When it became obvious that Mason wasn't getting up, Justin headed out onto the field with the team doctor. Clara wanted to rush out there as well, but as the newest trainer, that was not her place. Plus, it would announce her feelings for Mason to everyone in the stands. And after their interactions this week, she wasn't sure he'd be okay with that. So instead, she held her breath and watched. The seconds seemed to drag on forever. Did it always take this long? Had he lost consciousness? She hadn't seen him hit his head, but she supposed it was possible. The players on the field circled around Mason and the doctors, blocking her view. Frustration coursed through her, and she clamped her teeth together to keep from yelling at them to move. Finally, the sea parted, and a cheer rose up from the crowd. Mason was making his way over to the sidelines, but not by himself. His arms were slung over the shoulders of Justin and the doc, and only one foot was touching the ground as he made his way over. The other hung at an odd angle. Before she could say anything to him, they disappeared into the medical tent that sat on the sidelines. Clara blew out another frustrated breath as she clenched and unclenched her fists at her side. Right now, she definitely hated those tents. She wanted to see what was happening, to know that he was okay. The half ended and the tent stayed silent and impenetrable, with no update on Mason. Reluctantly, she followed Davis back into the locker room area. Hopefully, an update on Mason would come soon. She didn't think she'd be able to sit through the rest of the game if she didn't know what had happened to him. "I sure hope he's okay," Davis said as they restocked the supplies on the tables. The area where they were was eerily quiet, as the rest of the players were meeting with the coaches first, before seeing them again. "Me too." Clara hoped her voice didn't give her feelings away, but at this point, she cared less about that and more about finding out if he was okay. The door opened and she looked up, expecting to see the players coming in, although it would signal a short meeting. But Justin's face appeared instead. It was tight and pinched in a way she hadn't ever seen it. That couldn't mean good news. "Clara, can I see you for a moment?" Clara looked over at Davis with wide eyes before making her way to Justin. Was she in trouble? She didn't think she had done anything. She'd even told him her concerns. But she couldn't imagine why he would want to talk to her unless she was. When they were safely outside the room and away from other ears, Justin swallowed and looked down at his hands. He cleared his throat as if the words were hard for him to utter. "Mason needs to go to the hospital, and he needs someone from the team to go with him. I have to stay here and finish the game, and since you're the newest hire, and you suspected his injury beforehand, well, that straw belongs to you." Clara wasn't sure if he was chiding her or congratulating her for being right. She hadn't wanted to be right. She just wanted Mason to be safe. Whatever the connotation behind the words, though, they were music to her ears. Now she would finally know that he was okay, and she'd get to spend some time with him away from prying eyes. Careful to keep her face from showing her emotion, she nodded. "Yes, sir, I understand. Is there anything else I should know?" "Don't talk to the press, and keep the cameras away from him. I think you were right in that he tore his Achilles, but if it isn't that bad, we don't want word of the injury getting out, and them removing him from playing the next game, if there is a next game." He spoke as he walked, leading her toward the exit. By the time he reached the end of his sentence, they were at what appeared to be a backdoor entrance of the stadium. Justin pushed open the door, and Clara saw the ambulance, silent and idling. "He's inside. Go ahead and climb in back, and remember, no press." "Got it, but I didn't grab my bag. Can you make sure it gets taken care of?" Justin nodded, though his attention seemed to be elsewhere. "Sure, I'll have Davis take care of it." Clara hoped he would, but she didn't feel like pushing the issue. Mason was what mattered right now. She knocked on the back door of the ambulance and it swung open. An EMT offered her a hand up, and she sat down in a makeshift chair near Mason's head. "Are you it then?" the EMT asked. "Yes, we can go now." Clara kept her eyes on Mason, whose eyes were closed. Was he resting? Unconscious? The back door shut, and the ambulance rolled forward. The movement stirred Mason, and his eyes flicked open. "Clara?" She smiled and nodded. "It's me, Mace. I'm riding to the hospital with you." "Good. I'm glad it's you. I love you, Clara." His words were soft and fuzzy, as if he was speaking through a dream or a haze of pain. She blinked, waiting for him to say more, but his eyes merely closed again. "I love you too, Mason," she thought. But she couldn't bring herself to say the words out loud. Not yet.